I, uh, I think this is a great place to begin, a singular modernity. It's what I wrote a verse for the Verso blog, the Jameson at 90. I wrote my blog post about this text. In part, I was like, "Oh, this is a short text. I have time for this, so I can reread this." And I think it's always smart to begin a reading group with an accessible text as far as length is concerned. Now, accessibility as far as content concerned, that's I think why we're all here. I'm going to give a couple prefatory remarks about this book in particular, and then turn things over to my esteemed colleague Anna to talk about how this work fits into Jameson's body of work. But I would be remiss if I didn't highlight something Matt just pointed out, that modernity is a key concept for Jameson, and indeed it's a key concept for all Marxists. I'm thinking of Raymond Williams' comment that Marxism is an epochal form of analysis. It is a particular historiography. It's a particular type of historicism that works on macro levels, epochal levels. And Jameson being a Marxist, there's no way around the fact that he's going to be thinking in these large epochal terms. And that indeed is modernity in a nutshell. That's the name for this historical epoch that we find ourselves either still in or in the legacy of. So it's interesting that Jameson writes his famous postmodernism book and then goes backwards, reflects backwards to start analyzing the term modernity and modernism. Singular modernity is in many respects an introductory theoretical, he calls it a long form essay that sets up and stages his later book called The Modernist Papers. And it's not really a book either. Benjamin Kunkel has a really nice introduction to Jameson's thought in Utopia or Bust, where he says Jameson doesn't write books so much as sheaves of essays. Another reason why I think this is we can talk about this first part of a singular modernity, and it has a certain integrity and autonomy to it, and that we can do that without doing too much injustice to the rest of the work. But again, we'd be remiss if we didn't think about this book in terms of following on the heels of the postmodernism book. And that strikes right at the fourth maxim of this book, which is that no theory of modernity makes sense unless it contends with postmodernity. So there's something about like a historical backward glance. Retroactively, we can understand something about modernity that we didn't know before, looking at what came after postmodernity. So it is kind of, again, this dialectical movement that retroactively reads the past in terms of what's become more present since. And why is he returning to this, and what's up with the phrase singular modernity? I think the major theoretical opponents that he's facing in this book are ideologues of modernity, right? He says there's been certain intellectual regressions under the slogan of modernity, essentially regressive conceptuality of the modern. And it's really important to take note that those intellectual regressions are themselves symptoms of something in post-modernity, right? That post-modernity is creating certain ideologies of its roots in modernity. And he says that one of the other maxims, I think this is maxim 2, that modernity isn't a concept. And so the folks who would be turning it into a concept are committing some ideological misstep. He lists 14. He says instead of it being a concept in maxim 2, it's a narrative category. Nevertheless, he lists 14 possible narratives to tell about modernity. And as somebody who I teach this class at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. It's a general education course on the history of the modern world. And it's impossible to teach that course without engaging with these certain narratives, right? All these very important narratives. A major narrative that he treats in this introductory essay is the Cartesian revolution, right? Descartes and modern subjectivity. You can't teach a course like that without relying on these narratives. Nevertheless, if those narratives become the dominant narrative you're telling about modernity, then again, you've slipped into some kind of ideology of modernity. And this Proglamena essay here, this theoretical working through the missteps that people make, the misuses, the uses and abuses, if you will, to use a Nietzschean term, the uses and abuses of modernity in these theories. All of this is a working through to get to the underlying premise that a singular modernity is concomitant with capitalism itself. That's what it means. That really we're looking at the totality of capitalism, and that a better term perhaps for modernity is capital. Although I think modernity gives us a historical time frame. It gives us a historical framework to say that it's probably best it's a shorthand for capitalist modernity, right? Capitalist modernity. Final thing I want to say before I'll turn things over to Anna is that one of the modernization theory. This is a post World War II Cold War kind of context that people, American imperialists are putting forward this kind of functionalist sociological perspective that advanced countries develop along a certain path. Hence your first world, second world, third world. Hence when we abandon that kind of the connotations of the ranking there, moving to the still problematic more developed countries, MDCs, and less developed countries, LDCs. There's still this narrative, this teleological narrative that progress and development is linear and it follows along capitalist terms. I think it's really important to keep that in mind, as well as this concept. If it's a singular modernity, what would be the opposite of that? Well, this idea of alternative modernities, and that's the cultural moment, 2002, late 90s, early 2000s that Fred's writing about. Is that there's he calls it a pious hope for cultural variety. I love that. Pious hope for cultural variety. This cultural notion of alternative modernities. He sniffs some ideology there too, that there's something noble about this idea that maybe there are other forms of modernity. There's something maybe perhaps utopian about that, but it disregards the fact that no, modernity is modernity. It is capitalism. And if you can't talk about capitalism, then you are in some kind of idealistic historiography. And as far as the rest of the book, this historiographical section is followed by a transitional intermezzo chapter on Paul de Man, really interesting essay that he has about literary modernism, and then it shifts to talking about modernism itself, where I don't want to spoiler alert. He already gives it to us in the prefatory remarks here in the preface. He reads modernism as a cultural formation that coincides with an incomplete form of modernization. I just think that is so brilliant, that what makes modernism is that modernization, capitalist modernization, is still unfolding, and it's much more incomplete than it is today. And ergo, there's some utopian elements in modernism that we could return to find different paths that we might have taken that were not following the unfolding of capital, global capital. Those utopian traces are worth following, and they're definitely worth distinguishing between those and what he ends up calling late modernism, where modernism becomes a pure aesthetic ideology, kind of art for art's sake. One that really takes off in the United States, again, to bring it back to American empire, that, abstract expressionism as the CIA's depoliticized art forms that we're going to spread American culture around the world to. But anyway, so that's where the second half of this book goes. So if you're interested in following through in the cultural formations of modernism, this whole first half sets up the idea that modernity is capitalist. And then the second half will talk about modernism as a cultural formation. And I think that's probably a good pass off to Anna here to talk about Fred's larger work and the bigger questions that he's interested in.
Thank you guys all for doing this, especially Dennis and Matt. It's just like to echo how wonderful it is to have people together in a kind of para-institutional way, committed to just thinking together. And let me just underscore, if my own crashing didn't just do that, that we don't totally know exactly who we're talking to or what the appropriate level at which to pitch things is. So you'll see in the Google Doc of questions that there's a kind of variety of questions. I will want to punctuate a few kind of things that Kirk said, hopefully not too repetitively, and then point to some slightly other considerations by way of breaking us towards conversation. I also just want to take one moment to say that for anybody who will be at MLA, that the Marxist Literary Group is working on a kind of unhappy hour memorial informal concept there. So hopefully I'll be able to distribute information about that. But if you don't hear anything about it, get in touch with me, because we're trying to put that together. These spaces of intellectual togetherness are so important. So, speaking of the where are we pitching things, just to sort of say, because I think it always is worth saying, even if people have been Jameson readers forever, and I'm sure some of the many people here with us have been in our well-nigh, hashtag well-nigh reading groups on Jameson and Adorno and the pandemic and so on, that it is, when we call him the greatest Marxist critic of the 20th century, that is for a lot of reasons. And one of them is because he was kind of the longest standing one in so many ways, right? He emerged in the McCarthyite 1950s in New England, and he became an avowed Marxist in the early 1960s at a time when it was basically still illegal to say any of those words. And he never, ever gave up, despite many valleys in fashion, despite many nadirs of left power. And I always just want to say that, because I think this book is in that trajectory of commitment, and part of understanding what is actually so powerful and weird and polemical about this book is understanding that he was a steadfast Marxist even in 2002. This book is very representative of his steadfast commitment. 2002 is the post 9/11 swirl of things like the clash of civilizations, of world pluralizations, as Kirk was sort of alluding to, right? Of cultural relativism, of the critique of imperialism, and therefore the kind of conflation of the epistemic formations of universalist philosophy or a Marxist philosophy of history with the actual material programs of violence, right? And that conflation is one of the kinds of regressions that I think he is naming. And so this book comes out as a clarion insistence amid a lot of really polemicized and also tortured and also, I think, degenerate intellectual stuff that was reactive to 9/11. It's a clarion insistence to keep your eyes on capitalism, to keep your eyes on the global structure of social totality, on its impetus, and on its cause. So that's a kind of geopolitical, world historical place of this book, right? It is an effort to conceive of world history, and to do so at a time when there was a lot of really contentious conceiving of that going on in the pages of every newspaper and in the tanks, right? So, just to sort of hit again this idea of singular as opposed to what is very specifically as opposed to plural. There's a fashionable pluralizing at the time that Jameson is writing this, from the 90s onward, but especially again in this 9/11 context. There is not modernity, but modernities. That's a truism of 90s life, right? That there is difference globally means that there is plural modernity, Chinese modernity, Brazilian modernity. And Jameson just dismisses all of this with the first word of the title, right? With the first word of the book. No, there is a singular modernity, right? And he is adamant throughout the book, as Kirk has already said, that the only adequate meaning of modernity is capitalism. He reserves the idea of alternate modernity for socialism. So a singularity, a uniformity, and that has to do with causality, as we will get to in a second. So there's a place in world history where this argument is happening, and there's a place in the Jamesonian world that is internal to his project. This book is, as Kirk also wisely started us with, in many ways a reflection on postmodernism. It comes out 13 years after that truly monumental work, and it is doing a lot of working through of the consequences and entailments of that argument, including things that it's only possible to understand about that argument after postmodernism, after he makes it, right, and after people react negatively to it. There are, in the reactions to postmodernism, a kind of a fair amount in the 90s of articulating of a sort of ban on periodization, a ban on categorization as homogenizing operations that neglect difference. And he, says in postmodernism itself that his antagonists are endeavoring to foster, this is a quote, foster a perception of history as sheer heterogeneity, random difference, and a coexistence of distinct forces whose effectiveness is undecidable. Those are his opponents, right? The project in postmodernism, which is also the project re-articulated in singular modernity, is that history is not heterogeneous in an undecidable way. There is a responsible, coherent, and defensible philosophy of history, which is Marxism, which centers causes in historical narrative. Okay, so the book is sort of, digesting postmodernism, digesting the negative reaction to postmodernism. It's also, as it tells us in the small note preceding the table of contents, occupying an important place in this lifelong Jamesonian project of the poetics of social forms. And I just want to ping this also for people who have or have not read many of these things, that even though he wrote like 30 books, right, and he was always, kind of coining important concepts that help us do constructive work, he really kind of thought of himself as having like 6 books, and that was the point of his work, the books that were anointed in the project of the poetics of social forms. He announces the publication of that project in postmodernism, and postmodernism is positioned as the penultimate volume in that series, right? So he says, this is a new book. I'm doing a new kind of work in the postmodernism, even though he'd already written many books, right? And that this is going to be 5th in a series of 6. So he sets that, work plan for himself in the 1990s. And the point of the poetics of social forms is to provide a coherent and general history of aesthetic forms that is in tandem with a history of economic formations, a history of social relations. And okay, how is that in tandem? That's the meat of the, kind of debating, and let us underscore poetics there. But he is trying to do like a lot of history in this project. And A Singular Modernity is the main theoretical text in that 6-book project. It is, as Kirk already said, it's a theoretical essay, right? It's not a historiographic work. It's not a study of historical movements in culture in the way that so many of his other books are. It is intended to be book 4 in the series. And he wrote all the other books after it. So Antinomies of Realism ends up being book 3. Allegory and Ideology is the second book. I can put a like kind of chart of what the 6 are in the chat in a minute. But basically, there's a historical progression among them. It starts with myth. This is the one he didn't finish. He was relearning ancient Greek right now. Some of us probably saw him give this talk on the Iliad at MLA, right? But myth in the classical sense and in a pre-capitalist sense was volume 1, and then allegory, and then realism, and then modernism, and then postmodernism. And then, oh my God. And then 6 is Archaeologies of the Future, which is already a line in this book that's really important for us. So just understand that he's not writing chronologically this project, but this book is the theoretical anchor of this project. So that also makes it a cool kind of entry place for people for whom this might be their first Jameson. Understanding modernity and understanding the competing theories of modernity, holding up Marxism as the definitive philosophy of history and the most definitive narrative of modernity. All of that is foundational for this project of the Poetics of Social Forms, for historicizing how forms change in the sweep of human practice, and how we can understand those changes as caused by social and economic transformations. So just one more note about this, where it's his place in his own oeuvre also. We said postmodernism, a lot of the enemies or antagonists or regressions that he's talking about have to do with the conversations around postmodernism. But this also really, truly is a book that is a probably most celebrated volume, or next to postmodernism, right? But that's not on the list of the books in the Poetics of Social Forms. So he does not. Frozen?
You're back.
Okay,
Froze
sorry.
Yeah, froze after this is a book. Yeah, I think you were talking about the political unconscious, but I don't know.
Okay, I'm so sorry. So right, the political unconscious is not on the list of the 6 books in the Poetics of Social Forms. It's probably his most important book besides postmodernism, but why is it not on that list? And one way to think about it is that the political unconscious is maybe like an overture of the whole project. And that's because of the political narratology that he's inaugurating there, which is exactly the theoretical kind of gesture that is being re-performed here, right? We get post-structuralist delegitimation of narrative, and Jameson is making a riposte to that, which is that narrative is essential, right? This just insistence on narrative. Why, he says in the preface that he wrote to Lyotard's Postmodernism, the insistence on narrative analysis in a situation in which narratives themselves henceforth seem impossible is a declaration of intent to remain political. So why is narrative political? Why is this insistence on narrative something that he's doing in postmodernism, something that he is doing in the political unconscious, something that he's doing in a singular modernity, perhaps above all? Narratives put together in systematic and historical ways what ideology insists on presenting as random, as separate, as just, the play of difference. And it also opens up the possibility of establishing relationships, narrative, between what appear as separate phenomena, as well as between those, all the individual separate things and the kind of register of totality, which is the horizon for thought. Narratives have a cause. This is, literary nerdy moment for the people who aren't in the literary side of things, but this is very much when Jameson is doing the insistence on narrative, it's from a literary kind of structural perspective. The theorist E.M. Forster makes this distinction where he says, the Queen died is an event. It's not a narrative. Only the Queen died of boredom is an event, is a narrative, right? You have to have causality to have narrative. And to insist on a cause for what transpires in the vast centuries and vast processes, industrial, political, technological, epistemological, of modernity, to insist that capitalism is the cause of that. That is the Marxist intellectual intervention that this book is making. So, okay, I think that I'm about ready to shut up. I just want to sort of hit again how much this insistence on causality, insistence on narrative, and insistence on like the possibility of philosophical explanation is his movement against the regressions of the 1990s. And those are regressions which are political, you know, the third way kind of Clintonian and Blairite, et cetera stuff, end of history, clash of civilizations. But there are also regressions that are intellectual, the kind of just pluralization as some radical technique, and the inventory and catalog and listing of difference as some, you know, kind of echolalia of the theories of that moment, which continue to really be the dominant theories of our time. So it's because it's such a erudite book, I think it can be, especially if it's one's first time reading him, easy to underread how polemical it is and how, you know, kind of oppositional it is. But I just want to also kind of strike that as like why it's a dynamic choice for a first book for Jameson, even though lots of people may not have read it before, and even though it's a theoretical tome rather than a, you know, kind of critical treatise on specific aesthetic works. It's because there is so much at stake in being on the side of causality and the side of totality and the side of analytic clarity of the singular, as opposed to being on the side of exuberant pluralization. So I think that's about what I wanted to open with, and that there's a lot of space where, depending upon how our, you know, dynamic is with all these people in here, where Kirk and I can chat to each other, or we can see what questions the, am I doing that right, Dennis, right? We want to see what questions the totality of the Zoom has for us right now. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think folks feel free to start putting questions in the chat if you have questions. I know we've gotten a couple. You know, Kirk, if you want to respond to any of that, I think please feel free. You're both spotlighted. And yeah, as questions come in, we'll take them and we'll put them to both of you.
I think the only point I want to underscore is yeah, he calls it a fetish of difference at the very beginning, and I heard him say once that he had a phrase he wished would have taken off more, and it was another pithy maxim: difference relates. And I think that Marxists, you know, the charge against Marxists, there's often this kind of conflation of, if you state that capitalism is this kind of meta narrative of our lives, there's like an implication that you subscribe to that, like that you support it, like a description of reality as some kind of prescription for it. I think that's totally a categorical mistake. And one last thing I'll say is, I think maybe it's in Seeds of Time. It's a different book that I don't think it's this book, but he says, you know, underpinning all of this difference is this radical homogeneity of the market, of commodification, of commodity logic, of capital, and that all of this difference really is hiding that fact. And so I just to highlight, underscore a few things that Anna said.
Yeah, varied causes of exuberant pluralization. That's Sarah in the chat.
Good question.
Yeah. So I think it's the combination, as Kirk was just trying to articulate it, maybe he has a better answer to this, but the combination of the prevailing pop political hypothesis about the end of history and the attendant smearing of anything to do with Marxism as totalitarian, which and backward, because now we're at the end of history and we know that we're going to keep on modernizing, right? So there's very, very much the kind of political ferment and ideological position of the 1990s, I think, that is there engendering what becomes the academic and also pop cultural exuberance of pluralization. I mean, there were, bumper stickers about celebrating heterogeneity in the that one could have in the 1990s. But I do think that it's sort of like the ideology academically and the pop culture ideology is really just trying to sort of metabolize this real question of, is history singular or not? And why is it that the cause of the singularity presents as if it is about freedom and differentiation? So that's how I would start with that. Let's see.
We had one, if I could just pull one
Please.
from that we got from
Oh yeah, you're manning that.
No, this is great. I think it's great to just like jump in, and we're getting a lot of them in the chat, and I want to say to everyone, I apologize, we're probably not gonna get to all these great questions. I'm gonna do my best to pull out some good ones, but we had a question that came in about so I'm just going to read it out. It's from Jay Harvey. My question is about clarifying a point that Jameson returns to repeatedly, the quote, unrepresentability of consciousness. So why is consciousness unable to be represented? He says, a few times, if consciousness cannot be represented, or because consciousness cannot be represented. So this person's wondering, kind of wanting some insight into what he means by that statement.
It's a good question. It's part of the extended discussion of that leads to maxim 3, right? Maxim 3. And by the way, this whole idea of like maxims reminded me of it might even underplay the nature of these statements by calling them maxims. But I was reminded of Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet. Begins with a set of axioms. So the introductory essay is a set of axioms. This is almost like a set of axioms, but this is the maxim against. Let's see here. It reads 3: the one way not to narrate. Not to narrate it is via subjectivity. Only situations can be narrated, and it's I don't necessarily have a very good answer for why consciousness, why he's saying that itself can't be that can't be narrated. But I will say that when you make the narrative about consciousness, about subjectivity, then you are engaging in an idealist historiography. That's how I read that. That if you're going to put forward a materialist historiography, and he announces that in the title, it's an ontology of the present. It's not a phenomenology of the present. It's an ontology. It's a social ontology of the present. He's announcing the materialist underpinnings of this history. Then references to consciousness, references to subject would put you in idealist territory, ideological territory.
Anna, I think, is Anna frozen, maybe, unfortunately? Oh, wait. Sorry, Anna, did you want to say anything about that? Or
I'm sorry, I might have been freezing a little bit again, but I think Kirk is doing right. I think the only other thing to add to that, maybe, and forgive me if I missed a little bit of what he said, is that doing the narrative of modernity and modernism in terms of a subjective term is just not really, it not only is it dematerialized history, but it's just historically kind of out of joint. Like when he emphasizes so much like that Henry James is one who represents consciousness, when he understands the kind of depth of the aesthetic modes that are dedicated to the representation of the complexities of subjectivity and interiority, and how much they predate some of the things that we would associate with modernity, just doesn't, but it's like a kind of philosophical concern that doesn't map onto adequate historical coordinates for him, I think.
Great. I'm gonna read out another question that's in the chat. Again, there's really, really great questions. So sorry we can't get to all of them. But this is from Elias. So I'm trying to square the insistence in Maxim 4 on having an account of postmodernity with the singularity of modernity. If it's true that modernity is just capitalism, a view Jameson ascribes to Marx, is Jameson's account of postmodernity simply that it's a subset of modernity, i.e. capitalism? And there's more to the question, but I'll just leave it at that for you guys to kind of chew on.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
another great question.
part of the struggle, I think, is the relationship between the word modernism or postmodernism and postmodernity. And I think that he is in this book coming into some sense that modernism, modernity, modernization have to all be disarticulated, and that you shouldn't use postmodernism and postmodernity as synonyms either, and that postmodernism is recognizable as an aesthetic and ideological metabolization of certain kinds of transformations in modernity. And he says, indeed, the more of a conclusion of modernization, right? So I think Dennis and Matt were kind of pointing us to, he talks in this book about modernism being the, middle phase of capitalism, right? Modernism being insufficient modernization. And certain of those processes, like the totalization of the world market and this kind of subsumption of national sovereignty into multinational corporations and NGOs, and these kinds of features of the moment of legal and economic globalization, are fulfillments of the modernization process, which then get metabolized differently aesthetically.
Yeah, that's great. The isms are the cultural formations. The modernity, post-modernity are historical stages, right? And the post-modernity and shares with modernity. Post. We always talked about post. It's been a huge prefix for theorists, right? Because it's coming after, but it's a continuation thereof. And what's being continued is it's the same system. It's just a system. The system has more fully developed. It's become purer. It's become more global, more ubiquitous. But it is still the same system. The logic hasn't changed.
Great. So I think we're gonna do just one more in the full group, and then we're gonna go to breakout groups. And I'm gonna try to kind of pull from a couple of different ones because it's come up a bit. But I think a lot of people want to sort of hear from you both about the maxim "we cannot not periodize," which makes sense. But like kind of, and I think maybe a few people have raised sort of like, what does this mean in practice, or like how does this work as a method? So yeah, if you want to kind of take the floor and expand on that, yeah.
Yeah, great. I'd love to hear what Anna has to say about this. She was asking some questions about, I think they might be on the sheet, about continuity and rupture. And I think that there's some of that that plays into this negation of the negation. Like, we cannot not periodize. It reminds me of the statement at the end of Archaeologies of the Future, where he says we have to be anti-utopianism. And that's different than saying, we have to be utopian, or we have to be against dystopia. I think he's highlighting that periodization is ultimately not just difficult, but extremely fragile, because we don't know how things unfold, right? So there is something that you're risking the impossibility of doing when you construct the narrative that you're telling. Inevitably, it's going to be about the present. It's going to have the present perspective. Inevitably, we all fall into history because we are in history. And so the narratives that we tell are going to reflect our positionality. Nevertheless, there's no other choice but to tell the story, but to tell the narrative, but to periodize. And so I think that's what he's getting after with that, with the kind of double negation there.
I think that's totally right. And I just want to add to that, that the double negative formulation is a real statement of the opening salvo always historicize, right? This is a refiguring, the opening salvo of political unconscious. So again, this kind of argument that singular modernity is here sort of redoing political unconscious in certain ways, re-inaugurating political narratology, that always historicize, people sort of instantly took pot shots at it as like an unhistorical universal, right? Like that there's definitely contradictory about it, and that the cannot not periodize is more dialectically supple because of that double negative. And it indicates more necessity than, in a kind of different register. And, when Kirk says like, we have to do it, you have to figure out where you are, right? You have to situate yourself. That is not just an kind of like intellectual exercise, right? It's not just, oh, we need to know where we are in history and we need to have a good theory of history, right? It is a political and practical exercise that one cannot participate in this struggle for emancipation, which is a struggle for the future, which is, as he says, in a couple of places here, actually then a struggle for the present, right? To kind of dynamize the present, and to sort of recognize the contingent openings in the present. You cannot participate in that without, a kind of project, without a kind of vision, without a coherent narrative of what needs to be transformed so that we can come up with, political relations that are more adequate for human beings, right? And that he does really, I think, try to underline here that having a relationship to periodization, having in a relationship to causal narratives, having an aspiration to totality in your thinking is political strategy. It's not just intellectual exercise.